Hey folks, welcome to the Ramble. So, for some reason, who can say what reason in particular, our own motivations are often mysterious even to ourselves, but for some reason, I was doing some research over the last couple of days on the subject of impeachment and how it works in the United States, how it is defined in our Constitution, and just in case you haven't done this research yourself, but maybe you've been curious about it. Again, who can say why we might all be interested in this all of a sudden? The process of impeachment, the limitations of it, the scope of it, the procedure of it, this is all defined in Article 2 of the United States Constitution. And Article 2, Section 4, actually, is the impeachment section. And it reads, "The President, Vice President, and all civil officers of the United States shall be removed from office on impeachment for and conviction of treason, bribery, or other high crimes and misdemeanors." And the process of impeachment, actually, it has been used quite a few times throughout the history of the United States. There have been more than a few federal officers who have been impeached. They haven't all been convicted. They haven't all been successfully removed from office, but they have been impeached. And in fact, and again, there's really no reason in particular I can think of to be thinking about this one example, but there have even been impeachment proceedings brought against a Supreme Court justice in the past. It's been a long time, and it's only happened once, I believe, according to my research, but Samuel Chase, who was a Supreme Court justice in the very, very earliest years of the court. He was a Supreme Court justice. He was impeached during the Jefferson administration in 1805, and he was brought up on counts of impeachment because he was determined or charged, at least, with being partial, with not being impartial, I was about to say, with being partisan, with being too political in his rulings, in his activities as a judge, and specifically for actions he took on the court, not in the Supreme Court, but while acting as a trial judge. So he was impeached from his seat in the Supreme Court for things he took, for actions he took while he was acting not as a Supreme Court justice. And it was a little different back then than it is now. Back then, Supreme Court justices also sat as judges in lower courts. They had kind of a simultaneous duty where, yes, they would sit as part of the Supreme Court and they would hear cases as justices of the Supreme Court. But when the Supreme Court wasn't in session, they would also be judges on lower courts. And it was for his actions as a judge in a lower court that Chase was impeached on the charges of not being impartial, of being too partisan as a jurist. So what I'm saying is, if it could be shown that a justice on the Supreme Court had acted improperly, even if the improper action had taken place outside of the Supreme Court, say on a lower court, or in a proceeding not involved with the court that demonstrated that maybe his impartiality was highly questionable, maybe that he did not have the independent mindset and the judicial temperament necessary for a Supreme Court justice, then he could be impeached on those grounds. And I suppose it would also be reasonable to say that a Supreme Court justice who was found to have conducted himself in a way that was unbecoming of the court, in a way that would probably see him removed from the court if it were a lower level, would certainly be impeached or impeachable from the Supreme Court on that basis. For instance, if it could be shown that the Supreme Court justice in question had lied to a committee of the United States Senate, maybe had lied repeatedly to a committee of the United States Senate in ways that are clear and demonstrable, provable, inarguable, the kinds of issues that maybe should have been taken more seriously before this Supreme Court justice was even confirmed, let's say, speaking hypothetically. I think in that instance, that would be a case where that justice would be, I would say, a fair subject for impeachment. Would you not say? If that had happened, if there were a justice, if there were a Supreme Court justice who it could be shown had lied to the Senate, wouldn't that be an impeachable offense, wouldn't you say? And if, still talking about the same justice, if we added to that offense of lying to the United States Senate the fact that he was credibly accused by multiple people of acts of sexual assault, that's certainly conduct unbecoming a jurist in the United States federal court, especially the United States Supreme Court, would you not say? So if it could be shown that there were credible allegations of sexual misconduct against this judge, that would also be a very excellent reason to impeach this justice and perhaps even to convict him on those charges and to remove him from office. I would say, I think that would be a not unreasonable suggestion were we in such a circumstance. But of course, there would be no chance at all to remove this grossly unfit justice from the Supreme Court if the current minority party, who is opposed to him and who is raising concerns about him, were to remain in the minority, even if they were not able to win enough seats in the upcoming election to impeach him on their own. They could win a majority, hold a majority, and then in 2 more years, in the next election, they could add to that majority and eventually get to a point where they have enough seats on their own that they could impeach this grossly unfit justice and deny him a lifetime seat on the Supreme Court, and then replace him with a more fit justice who could then presumably serve out a much longer, more appropriate term. None of it would happen at all, whether it happens this year or next year or in 2 years or in 3 years. None of it will ever happen if the party which opposed the nomination and the confirmation of this unfit justice in the first place remains in the minority party. They must win a majority of both houses of the United States Congress. They must win a majority of the House of Representatives and also a majority and eventually a supermajority, a 2/3 majority of the United States Senate for any of this to be even remotely plausible. You know, if I can just dispense with the whole cutesy, precious, hypothetical thing that I've been doing for the whole video and just speak to you directly for the last couple minutes of the video. Someone asked the current Senate Majority Leader, Mitch McConnell, on Saturday, after Brett Kavanaugh was confirmed as a justice on the Supreme Court, if he was concerned about the level of anger that had been provoked as a result of all of this, as a result of the misconduct, the sexual misconduct allegations against Judge Kavanaugh, as a result of his seeming perjury, as a result of his terrible behavior during his hearing following Dr. Ford's testimony. All of this, the frustration, the anger, the disillusionment, if he was worried about this, McConnell was asked, are you concerned about this going forward? And he said, oh, no, these sorts of things always blow over. Well, I think it would be a really wonderful thing if Mitch McConnell and all of the other Republicans in the Senate and the House of Representatives, and Donald Trump and Mike Pence, and all the people who voted for these people and continue to support them and rationalize them and defend them and apologize for them, if that whole group of people, all the people who are responsible directly and indirectly for this happening, if they were forced to choke on those words that Mitch McConnell said, when Mitch McConnell said, oh, we're not worried about this because, you know, the anger and the frustration and the outrage over these sorts of things, it tends to blow over. Let's make him choke on those words, shall we? I think that would be a really terrific thing. If we, as Americans of conscience, as we Americans who are disgusted and upset and saddened and outraged by the Brett Kavanaugh affair, by the fact that a man like that could be pushed on to the United States Supreme Court despite mountains of allegations and things that should have caused serious reservations in the minds of the people who were pushing him to that seat. Let's make Mitch McConnell and the rest of the Republican Party and everybody else who is responsible for this choke on those words. Let's make sure that we don't let it blow over. Let's make sure that we don't forget. Let's remember 4 weeks from tomorrow, Election Day, November 6th, 2018. Let's remember that far, and let's remind them with our votes. Let's remember for the 2 years after that, on the next election, the next presidential election. Let's remind Mitch McConnell of that as well, because I believe Mitch McConnell himself is up for re-election that year, in addition to president and vice president and quite a few other members of the Senate and all of the members of Congress. Let's remember for 4 weeks and remind them that we haven't forgotten. Let's remember for 2 more years and remind them on that election day that we haven't forgotten. And let's just make it a habit every 2 years or so to remind Mitch McConnell, and once he's gone, the other Mitch McConnells of the world, the people who continue to try to push atrocities like Brett Kavanaugh, Supreme Court Justice, on this country and use them as tools to ravage this society and strip people of their rights and human dignity. Let's remind them on election day every 2 years and continuously in the interim space as well. Let's remind them all that actually this time it's not going to blow over and we're not going to forget. It's not going to be something that, well, now that we won, we can forget about it. Now that he's on the Supreme Court, we can forget about it. Because we think about the Supreme Court as a lifetime position. And all things being equal, it is. In most circumstances, under normal circumstances, it is. You get on the court, you stay on the court. But it is not a permanent position, is it? It's subject to oversight. It's subject to impeachment and removal. We need to push for a Democratic Party that is bold enough and strong enough in terms of will and in terms of numbers, in terms of how large their majorities are, to do that, to remove this man who never should have been there in the first place. We need to empower them to do that and push them to do that and make sure they don't forget that that's what we want them to do. You see, one of the things that the Republican Party has thrived on, especially since Trump got into office, but really over the last 40 years, they have thrived on smashing political and social norms for their own purposes while counting on their opponents continuing to respect those norms. And I think there are a lot of Republicans who think that the Democrats won't have the guts, even if they come to a point where they have the numbers, that they won't have the guts to impeach a Supreme Court justice or a president. That they just won't have the will to do it, because that would be shattering a norm. Meanwhile, they shatter every norm that is inconvenient to them and their purposes. Well, you know what? I think it's time for the Democratic Party, and for those of us who support and empower the Democratic Party, to let them know that it's okay if they disregard a few norms every now and then too. That it's time for them to stop, as I saw someone on Twitter tweet, I can't remember who it was, Benjamin Dixon retweeted it. I can't remember who it was who actually tweeted this, but it's time for the Democrats to stop bringing casseroles to gunfights. It's time for them to stop respecting norms while Republicans gleefully smash them, knowing that the Democrats will continue to respect them. Now, the Democratic Party is not noted for its spine. So as I've already said, we are going to have to give them the courage to do this. We're going to have to push them to do this. We're going to have to send enough of them to Washington, D.C. that they will be able to do it. And then we are going to have to make sure that they know that we are standing right behind them. In support, yes, but also in oversight. We're there to make sure they do what they're supposed to do. Yes, we want them to feel encouraged. We want them to feel empowered. We want them to know, yes, we are right behind you. But we also want them to know that they had better do what is right. They better do the righteous thing, not the politically expedient thing. And if they ever fail to do that, remember that we're right behind you.